So starting on top of page 142, chapter 4, part 2, the New World Culture. The East has had and will continue to have great influence on the spiritual heritage of the world, and therefore upon the outlines of the new humanity. For all its material backwardness, the East remains spiritual. For ages, it has been the home of avatars, prophets, masters, seers, and sages, whose contribution to the spiritual evolution of humanity has been unparalleled. It is essential that the spiritual atmosphere of the East be maintained, even at the cost, if necessary, of material unhappiness. If the East's spiritual power and value are retained, the suffering of her people will finally be supplanted by happiness. The current problems of the East are more complex in some ways than those the West is required to solve. Men of all races, creeds, cults, and religions are to be found in the East. Although this lack of racial and cultural uniformity has presented difficulties in developing solidarity in the national life of the East, it must not be regarded as being an unrelieved handicap. The various streams of culture pouring into the life history of the East in particular, and of the world in general, have added to the wealth of its resources. They have not only created a suitable opportunity for the generation of a new cultural synthesis, but have required its emergence. Under deft and creative leadership, such conflicting elements can bring a rich new culture into existence, capable of rejuvenating and harmonizing the life of the whole world. A new, cohesive, vital culture cannot be brought to life by a purely mechanical combination of isolated elements selected from present cultures. This could only result in a vague patchwork with no spontaneous life of its own. Such a hodgepodge of assembled ideas can never be a substitute for that essential element from which a new culture must be generated. A direct, fresh perception of the goal. The new world culture must emerge from an integral vision of truth, springing independent of existing traditions and unrelated to any laborious compilation of historical values. The new world culture, born from the new humanity and its integral vision, will automatically involve a cultural synthesis. The vision that inspires the new culture will be comprehensive. It will not deny the value of diverse traditions, nor will it merely accord them patronizing tolerance. On the contrary, it will entail active appreciation of the diverse religions and cultures. This vast vision of the truth cannot be limited by any creed, dogma, or sect. It will actively help people to transcend these limitations. not by blind negation of the value of the existing creeds, but by discovering, accentuating, unfolding, and cherishing the facets of truth which are in them. Another task which confronts the creative leadership of the East is to strive for political poise in spite of the difficult position the East occupies in international circles. The East can never make its full contribution to the world unless it is free from external political domination and fear of foreign aggression. Insistence upon this fundamental point, though, should not disturb its political poise, nor push it into a vitiated and reactionary isolationism. On the other hand, any future discharging of the clear duty to resist foreign aggression should not involve it in a sense of hate, malice, or revenge. This in turn raises the perplexing question of the utilization of nonviolence, which has been such an active tool in India's recent past. Aggression must be met with resistance, and in such case, nonviolence is impractical. Pure nonviolence or incorruptible love only comes spontaneously when duality has been completely transcended in the realization of the last and only truth. Even nonviolence of the brave is possible only for advanced souls who have eradicated all forms of greed and hate from their minds through rigorous discipline. For the masses, it is undesirable to adhere to external nonviolence when it is a question of clear duty to resist aggression in their own defense or in the defense of weaker brothers. Insistence upon universal nonviolence can only lead the masses to a cowardly, irresponsible, and inert attitude. True love is no game for the faint-hearted and the weak. It is born of strength and understanding. In its enthusiasm for the highest ideal, wise leadership can never afford to lose sight of the relative and practical. Human evolution proceeds by gradual stages from selfish violence to unselfish violence, and then from nonviolence of the brave to the pure and incorruptible nonviolence of truth as infinite love. Each individual exists at some point in this succession, and their duty in time of war is indelibly determined by that position. All narrowness limits love. In the East, as in the rest of the world, humanity is breaking itself into narrow groups based upon caste, creed, race, nationality, religion, or culture. All this is due to ignorance, prejudice, and selfishness. It can only be mended by fostering a spirit of mutuality which will derive its strength from a sense of the inviolable unity of all life. Creative leadership will have to recognize and then emphasize the fact that all people are already united, not only by their co-partnership in the great divine plan for the earth, but also by the fact that they are all equally the expression of the one life. No line of action can be really fruitful unless it is in complete harmony with this truth. There must be love for friend and foe, goodwill, patience, and forbearance. People must try to remedy their own defects instead of clamoring about the faults of others. The world will soon realize that neither cults, creeds, and ceremonies on the one hand, nor passionate striving for material welfare on the other, can ever bring about real happiness, but that selfless love and universal brotherhood and sisterhood can accomplish it. The future of humanity is in the hands of those who have this vision, and the role of the East in that future will be an irreplaceable one if it knits its spiritual and human resources together into a creative synthesis of its ancient heritage. Chapter 5, Notes on Freedom. Throughout the ages, the voice of mankind has been lifted up in a great clamor for freedom. The love and quest for freedom are principal characteristics of humanity, regardless of race, time, nationality, or geography. But in spite of the fact that freedom has been the watchword of groping mankind for so many thousands of years, there are very few persons who really understand the full implications of true freedom. There are many, though, who struggle to attain a relative freedom dictated by their partial understanding of the nature and conditions of true freedom. Thus, different persons long for different kinds of freedom according to the different things that they have come to value. Relative freedom, which is the brand of freedom usually involved, is sought in all phases of life and is usually related to the type of existence people wish to lead. For instance, those who identify themselves with their country instinctively work for national or political freedom. Those who are motivated by economic considerations strive for economic freedom. Those who are inspired by religious drives work toward religious freedom. Those who espouse some sociological or cultural ideology promote freedom of movement or speech. The localized freedom which grows from these limited goals is illusory and can only be termed a contrasting state in which the reverse of the discomforting situation prevails. It is a freedom of ignorance in which there is at best transitory peace and plenty, and passing relief and enjoyment. Regardless of the material bindings of the good and bad, spiritual freedom is always at hand, ready to be grasped by people. This is true because people's inherent spiritual freedom of the soul is eternal, infinite, and changeless, regardless of whether it is experienced with full human consciousness or not. Few realize that this is the basic freedom. It alone can give the stamp of true value to the different kinds of relative freedom. For in the long run, they are all dissolved in it. Even when the external conditions of a free life are completely fulfilled and guaranteed, the mind of people will still be in a straitjacket if people have failed to win spiritual freedom. External relative freedom is inevitably restricted by contact with other individuals. Therefore, external freedom is subject to redefinition and restriction within the limits imposed by group, communal, and national living. Inevitably, national rights in turn become subject to adjudication or violent readjustment because of the overlapping quote unquote rights of other nations. The constant adjustment of these so-called rights at all levels is completely incapable of final solution within the spheres of interest and controlling principles natural to them. Consciously or unconsciously, individuals as well as nations must draw upon a more reliable concept of freedom within which those rights may be resolved. National, economic, religious, and cultural freedoms are the reflection of the duality of existence. They exist only in varying degrees, subject to constant discordant adjustment. Even when won through persistent effort, they cannot be permanently maintained because the external conditions upon which they have been constructed are themselves subject to deterioration. Only spiritual freedom is absolute and unlimited. When it is won through persistent effort, it is won forever. For although spiritual freedom can and does express itself in the duality of existence, it is grounded in and sustained by the realization of the inviolable unity of all life. One important condition of spiritual freedom is freedom from all wanting. It is wanting itself which chains life by attaching to it the conditions in environment which would fulfill that want. If there is no wanting, there is no dependence, and therefore no limitation. The individual never achieves true freedom until they are no longer pushed or pulled by any inner compulsion. When they have worked through all the desires and worn them so threadbare that they can be or not be, have or have not, then they are free. It is here that the perfect masters are indispensable in helping to lighten this crushing burden of trying to wear out and discard the wants. When the individualized soul breaks through the encasing steel armor of wanting, it emancipates itself from its illusory bondage to bodies, mind, and ego. This is the spiritual freedom which brings with it the final realization of the unity of all life and puts an end to all doubts and worries. Fully conscious, eternal experience of spiritual freedom is the inevitable and final destination for all life and for each individual being. The method for abandoning the hold which duality has on consciousness is not simple. The more comfort and pleasure available to people, the less their chance for a strong enough push to force them to give up even the temporary happiness of their achievements. And yet they must eventually do this internally to bring the full focus of consciousness to bear on the experience of the eternally inherent self or soul with all its blissful freedom of real existence. This is why God loves most the so-called destitute and helpless. The greater the helplessness, the greater can and should be the dependence upon God for his help, which is ever more ready than are the sincere and earnest wishes for it. The greater the bindings, the greater the chances for quick, permanent relief through fully conscious experience of people's own original and everlasting freedom. The unlimited and everlasting spiritual freedom of the self or soul exists eternally and infinitely in one and all, and is equally available to every man and woman, irrespective of class, creed, or nationality. Spiritual freedom can and does transcend all the illusory phenomena of duality, because divine oneness is always divine oneness before the beginningless beginning and beyond the endless end. Contrarily, the illusion of all material binding from first to last is always illusion, and even its illusory existence depends upon the play of the eternal spiritual freedom of the soul. It is only in spiritual freedom that one can have enduring happiness and unhampered self-knowledge. It is only in spiritual freedom that one finds the supreme certainty of truth realization. It is only in spiritual freedom that there is a final end to sorrow and limitation. It is only in spiritual freedom that one can live for all and yet remain detached in the midst of all activity. Any lesser type of freedom is like a house built on sand, and any lesser attainment is fraught with fear of decay. There is no gift greater than that of spiritual freedom, and no task more important than helping others to find spiritual freedom. Those who have understood the supreme importance of spiritual freedom must not only strive for it themselves, but also share the God-given duty of helping others win it. Regardless of whether people are wealthy or poor, highly educated or illiterate, the only real help is to give them the perfect hope that everyone has a real equal opportunity to achieve everlasting freedom from all bindings. Helping others achieve spiritual freedom is very different from rendering other types of help. For the hungry, one can provide food and they have only to eat it. For the naked, one can provide clothes and they have only to wear them. For the homeless, one can provide houses and they have only to live in them. But for those who experience the agonies of human bondage, there is no ready means of providing immediate relief except by the grace of God. As a rule, spiritual freedom must be won through watchful and unfailing war against the lower self and its desires. Those who would help shoulder the load in the cause of truth have not only the responsibility of attaining the goal for themselves, but of extending love and understanding to others in every step which they take towards that attainment. There is no other way of sharing their burden. Real help in achieving the perfect hope of attaining spiritual freedom can only be given by the perfect master who has achieved with full consciousness the freedom of the self and at the same time continues to be fully conscious of the illusion of duality. From him or her, true and great help can be obtained, for they have experienced 100% of the truth of spiritual freedom and are 100% confident that the truth is real. Such a perfect master can give relief to humanity from immediate ignorance, as well as relief to the individual from continual ignorance. But direct help from a perfect master is rarely available. And so each individual must help others in every field of life to the utmost of their capacity. First, however, they must take every possible precaution against the development in themselves of a sense of obliging or of obligation in the receiver. This is best achieved by a feeling of pure love between people and people. Such selfless love springs from the profound understanding that each individual, on achieving full human consciousness, has arrived at the same threshold of infinite divine oneness. Each human being does possess, therefore, a truly equal spiritual opportunity to achieve the oneness of spiritual freedom, which is potentially as complete in themselves as in the other. Even though one may have tried to take every precaution to avoid any sense of obligation in the help one gives, undoubtedly there is every chance of this element entering to some extent through either giver or receiver. Still, this should be no cause for hesitation in rendering whatever relief one can provide. Although extending help to others is fraught with the danger of endlessly multiplying misery for both giver and receiver, people must nevertheless help their fellows with the same care that they meet their own needs. There are further questions of great importance in rendering help to a suffering humanity, such as temporary versus permanent relief. Often a sharp choice must be made. When immediate relief is likely to turn a curable case into an incurable one or to spread the infection to others, insistence upon immediate relief and refusal to try for a permanent cure is unthinkable. Similarly, there is no real value in helping if one robs Peter in order to pay Paul. There is no point in giving relief at one end by creating misery at the other. The question of pity for the suffering and downtrodden is also a moot one. Such expressions of pity in themselves are an expression of ignorance, as pity itself is invariably based on unconscious denial of the equal capacity for everlasting freedom of the self. There is no truth in the myth that the well-fed, well-clothed, well-educated can best find God. On the contrary, the so-called rich are comparatively more handicapped by fleeting comfort and mercurial resources than those who feel chained by their material needs. Since God loves the afflicted ones most, to emphasize their helplessness is to act in ignorance of their true state of grace. Instead of making them think more and more about their helplessness, they must be made to come nearer and nearer to God. Instead of stressing the limitations of some people, the emphasis should be placed on the limitations of all people. Instead of stressing the need that I help you or you help me, it should be we helping us. Instead of making ourselves and others helpless minded, we should become and help others to become helpful minded. The relative difference between people in material resources or physical endowment becomes lost like a mote of dust in the infinitely greater resources of the inner self, the treasure house of all. It must be impressed constantly upon humanity that the real birthright of every man and woman is to achieve their own original freedom, that it can be achieved, and that sooner or later it must be achieved. Without this, there is no lasting escape from the day to day problems of duality. People must be made to understand clearly that their present life is a chain of continuous strife, that this chain is composed of links of the opposite experiences of virtue and of virtue and sin, service and tyranny, etc. And the chain can never be permanently ended as long as ignorance is not eliminated by achieving the eternal experience of one's own self. Except in cases of complete physical helplessness, help can best be given by offering the individual work and making them feel that they are fit to do work. Yet even this help is superfluous when judged from the standpoint of spirituality. Real help that can be rendered humanity is to make people feel their inherent divinity and to cause them to see that the only purpose of life is to love God in order to become one in full consciousness with Him. No sacrifice is too great to set man and woman free from spiritual bondage and help them achieve spiritual freedom. This alone can bring peace to all, sustained unfailingly by an unassailable sense of universal fellowship and cemented by an ungrudging love for all as expressions of the same reality. Chapter 6, The Ways to the Path and its States and Stages. Truly happy people are rare in spite of the smiles, which are usually the brave front for varying degrees of internal misery. Yet everywhere and in every walk of life, people are longing for happiness and searching desperately for some means of breaking out of the trap which their life has become. It is not their fault if they assume that the solution to their deep dissatisfaction lies in a sensual life or in achievement in business or the social world or in a life of exciting experiences. Neither is it their fault if life is not usually long enough to teach them factually that they would find even more profound disillusionment if these goals were to be fulfilled to the hilt. If they would suspect that their ideas of achieving a successful and happy life were wrong, and that they must try some new way of living, then the stalemate might be broken. A new line in the divine picture is sketched only when some individual takes life forcefully in their hands, breaks up the old patterns, and insists on creating something new by their own inner vision. Progress in the inner life of the individual is accomplished by such a breaking with the old and venturing forth into new ways. True happiness can only come to one, pardon me, true happiness can come only to one who will find the courage to strike free of the attachments which they have formed throughout a sterile lifetime. If they will not do this, then they are shackled endlessly to the treadmill of oppressive action in which happiness is so transient that it has almost disappeared the moment it is experienced. After it has disappeared, there is left only the persistent, bottomless vacuity of mind, which strangles life, regardless of repeated efforts to fill it with endless experiences. Such suffering comes from blunt ignorance or persistent attachment to illusion. The average person plays with illusion as children play with toys. It is not easy for little children to give up their toys, and it is equally difficult for adults to relinquish the mental and emotional toys to which they have become habituated. The mind of the individual is very old, and through the ages, it has become deeply engrossed in playing with illusion. It has become addicted to this self-created spectacle, and it has had no thought other than to go on watching with fascination through cycles and cycles of creation. Mahu, could you unmute and continue? Thanks.
Sure. During this period of rebirth in cosmic illusion, the individualized soul becomes identified with the physical body due to the limitations imposed upon consciousness by the impressions or sanskaras. Its knowledge of reality is therefore necessarily restricted to the products and interferences of sense perception.
That's in inferences.
Oh, yes, thank you. I read that sentence again. Its knowledge of reality is therefore necessarily restricted to the products and inferences of sense perception. Information so obtained is completely inadequate and even misleading insofar as the true nature of reality is concerned. The quest for happiness is irretrievably enmeshed in the problem of the illusion of the world of form with which the individual self has become identified through the body. I read this part again. The quest for happiness is irretrievably enmeshed in the problem of the illusion of the world of form with which the individual self has become identified through the body. If this illusion can be shattered, the shackles which bind happiness are automatically shattered as well. But how to shatter the illusion? An individual who mistakenly believes he is a coward may live a lifetime of misery, during which all his actions are shaped by this incorrect belief. But if some event in his life challenges him so deeply that he unthinkably strides forth with great courage, then the illusion will suddenly vanish and he will see himself as a different being. Often he takes a real crisis to bring out a sure knowledge of the real inner self, and it is always a creative knowledge. Even as the individual can be wrong in his convictions regarding his own nature, so he is often quite wrong about the nature of the world around him. In reality, it is a world of illusion that separates him from his true birthright of freedom and happiness in oneness with the One. Actually, no individual is entirely devoid of some real happiness in some form. For God, as an endless and fathomless ocean of bliss, is also within every person, and no one is entirely cut off from him. Pleasures sought in illusion inevitably results in endless perpetuations of that very same false life of the ego, which leaves the individual exposed to intense suffering. Page 153. The whole play of illusion and the suffering it engenders functions by the divinely established law of karma, which is cause and effect. Therefore, suffering must be accepted with grace and fortitude. It must be remembered that one's own actions are the cause of much of one's suffering, and therefore wise action can minimize it. But real alleviation of suffering requires spiritual enlightenment. And for that, man must turn to the perfect masters and the God-man or avatar. If the world of form is only an illusion in reality, and if its harvest is such a rich one of misery, then why should its experience be required of the soul? Life in the world of matter is an unavoidable phase in the progress of the individual, inasmuch as it provides the field for action. Action is the expression and therefore the focusing of the mental and emotional impressions or sanskaras, which impel the individual. As the individual acts, other motivating forces incompatible with that momentary effort are withheld. Action is the paramount means through which the individual exercises discrimination in choice and adjustment between the many claims exerted upon his consciousness. Action also links a large number of individuals together through the innumerable karmic ties which have arisen out of past service and bondage. The material world offers the necessary environment for this interchange and the interdependence. On one hand, these karmic ties trap the mind as a complex web. On the other hand, they facilitate collective life with all its opportunities for exercise of love, sacrifice, service, and mutual help. Through the negative lessons of hate and malice, as well as the positive lessons of love and service, the individual finds himself compelled to participate in collective effort. The mind's seeming isolation is continually invaded by the life streams of other minds, ultimately enabling the individual to abandon entirely the illusion he had entertained of being separate. Thus, he gradually comes to realize the unity of all life. In spite of the suffering entailed, experience in the material world of action is thus not without compensating value. It constitutes a necessary phase in purifying the consciousness of the mind from all illusion in order that it may be transmuted into the consciousness of the soul. One sees then that the material and spiritual worlds of lower and higher illusion play an irreplaceable role in the divine game, which has as its goal that man shall become consciously aware of his own divinity. The positive values derived from the divine sport in illusion cannot be harvested without simultaneous collection of the residual byproducts of the coming to consciousness termed impressions or samskaras. A newly constructed building is not considered to be really completed until the debris of construction has been cleared away. I read this again. A newly constructed building is not considered to be really completed until the debris of construction has been cleared away. Similarly, the fully developed individual consciousness is not available for union with the divine until these residual products have been cleaned away and there is left only the completely untrammeled unitary nature of the individualized soul, now fully conscious of itself. As discussed earlier, in the process of both sleep and death, the individual returns unconsciously and briefly to the beyond state of God. In it, the soul achieves refreshment before it returns first to the subconscious state of ordinary dreams or the intense subconscious state of heaven or hell, and then to the ordinary conscious state of wakefulness or reincarnate life. The individual cannot remain in the beyond state of God for long and for very important reasons. The goal is to achieve the full awareness of consciousness, which is fully achieved when all the residual impressions have been dispelled. Full consciousness is achieved in the first human form, but remains captured, so to speak, by the residual impressions, which continue to exist regardless of the waking or the sleep state of the individual mind. It is as if they continued to stand as the unpaid balance of the price of consciousness. It is due to the standing impressions or samskaras that the individual consciousness must return again and again from oblivion to square its account with illusion, in illusion. However, consciousness must eventually disengage itself from enmeshment in the material realm of action, for in the long run, all activities of the worldly man are like the movements of someone on the surface of the ocean. He develops some knowledge of the ocean of life through these activities, but only as much as is obtainable through exploration on the surface of the ocean. The time inevitably comes when he wearies of surface wanderings and makes up his mind to plunge into the depths of the ocean of life. Thereupon, he becomes deeply concerned with the riddles of whither and whence, and this fact constitutes his spiritual birth, by which he is eventually ushered onto the path. The path of divine knowledge has both beginning and end. In rare cases, a pilgrim may be very advanced due to their efforts in previous incarnations. In such case, he may attain divine knowledge instantaneously as a gift bestowed upon him through the grace of the Master. In most cases, though the pilgrims has to travel the path by stages, attaining his knowledge gradually. Again, in most cases, though the pilgrim has to travel the path by stages, attaining this knowledge gradually. The understanding of God, which the average person attains through belief or reasoning, is so far removed from true understanding that it cannot be called inner knowledge. Such true knowledge, gnosis, does not consist in the construction or perception of an ideology. It is the product of ripening experience that attains increasing degrees of clarity. It consists in man's consciousness becoming more real and participating increasingly in the truth until there is nothing more to become and nothing more to assimilate. The devotional rituals followed in religions do not lead the seeker to the true inner journey, for in greater part they are mechanical observances barren of the redeeming experience of divine love. I love it. As the aspirant struggles through the obscuring fog of mental and emotional tension, his consciousness becomes more one-pointed, forming a spearhead that eventually pierces through the curtain to the inner path of divine knowledge.
Read this paragraph 2, please, Mahu.
Sure. Nevertheless, regardless of how rudimentary these types of belief and devotional observances may be, they do contain in latent form the future inner knowledge. As the aspirant struggles through the obscuring fog of mental and emotional tension, his consciousness becomes more one-pointed, forming a spearhead that eventually pierces through the curtain to the inner path of divine knowledge. Even the early glimpses of this knowledge which the pilgrim gets are a great advance over understanding that rests solely upon faith or reason. As the aspirant advances through the path, he undergoes a significant change of direction that might be compared to a somersault. I have to read this again. As the aspirant advances towards the path, he undergoes a significant change of direction that might be compared to somersault. He is now more concerned with the inner realities of life than with their outward expression. He is now more concerned with the inner realities of life than with their outward expressions. As the emphasis shifts from the external to the internal aspects of life, the deepening of consciousness is greatly accelerated. Now consciousness is no longer committed primarily to external incidents or routines, but is directed towards the deeper and truer aspects of being that demand greater integrity of thought and feeling. I have to read this again. Now consciousness is no longer committed primarily to external incidents or routines, but is directed towards the deeper and truer aspects of being that demand greater integrity of thought and feeling. Caught up with this deeper awareness of the self is a concurrent deepening of perception into the workings of the world. A refocusing of consciousness occurs, which is far-reaching. All the avenues through which the individual conducts his search are radically transformed by the sincerity and concentrated purpose of his effort. The increasing depths of his internal understanding suffuse every aspect of life, giving it new form and meaning, and causing him to hasten his exploration with greater exhilaration. Poise of the mind, born of the pilgrim's new understanding, automatically and unwittingly brings about a readjustment of material surroundings. And he finds himself at peace with the world. Conservatism, intolerance, pride, and selfishness are shed, and everything takes on a new meaning and purpose. Sinner and saint appear to be waves on the surface of the same ocean, differing only in magnitude, each the natural outcome of forces in the universal, in the universe rooted in time and causation. The saint is seen to have no pride of position, and the sinner no stigma of eternal degradation. Nobody is utterly lost, and nobody need despair. The internalizing, which is the real basis of entering upon the path, should not be confused with the purely intellectual discovery that there can be an inner life. Nor should the gradual and natural shift from the participation in external events to a focusing on inner development be confused with the limited intellectual detachment some persons achieve. Since such detachment is only intellectual, it brings freedom only in the realm of limited intellect and is usually characterized by a sort of dryness of being. The intellectually detached often try to shape the present in the light of knowledge of history, as well as through their insight into the possibilities of the unborn future. At best, such a purely intellectual perspective inevitably remains partial, sketchy, incomplete, and in a sense, even erroneous. Further, the intellectually detached are almost never in vital communication with the elements which so largely shape the course of the present. Therefore, their beliefs, even if transformed into effort, rarely produce marked results. The limited intellect is not competent to grasp qualities which are beginningless and endless. Intellectual perspective is workable and even indispensable for planned action. Yet, in the absence of illuminating wisdom of heart and clear intuition of a spirit, intellectual perspective gives only relative truth, bearing the ineradicable stamp of uncertainty. So-called intellectually planned action is really the product of waiting subconscious forces which have not yet risen to the threshold of consciousness of the planner. Thus, planning often leads to many results entirely unanticipated in the so-called planning. In other words, quote-unquote planning turns out to be planning mostly in name only, containing only sufficient conscious participation by the planners to satisfy their need to feel that they have a real share in the whole game. Intellectual perspective, intellectual planning, and intellectual detachment should therefore be carefully separated from the robust exploration of the inner self and the internalizing of the facts of existence that characterize the individual who has set forth on their path. Although the unfurling realization of divine knowledge is often figuratively described as traversing the path, this analogy should not be taken too literally. There is no ready-made road in the spiritual realm. Spiritual progress is not a matter of moving along a line already laid down and unalterably defined. Rather, it is a creative process of spiritual involution of consciousness. And this process is better described as a spiritual journey than as the traversing of a path. The journey is compared, in fact, to a flight through the air and not to a journey upon the earth, because it is only a pathless journey. I read this again. The journey is comparable, in fact, to a flight through the air and not to a journey upon the earth, because it is truly a pathless journey. It is a dynamic movement within the consciousness of the aspirant that creates its own path and leaves no trace behind it. The metaphor of the path is helpful to the aspirant in the early stages of his development, because it gives him the sense of new phases of consciousness to be experienced. This anticipation is stimulated further by accounts of others who have completed the spiritual journey. This makes the pilgrim's ascent easier than if it depended solely upon his own unguided efforts to visualize the probable path. While trying to understand the path as described by the masters, that aspirant must also make use of his own imaginative faculty, but within the constructive bounds defined in the master's spiritual guidance. Actual spiritual experience is as far removed from uncontrolled imaginative expectation as reality is from chaotic dreams. Though the imagination of the pilgrim is inevitably determined by past experience, it must offer no resistance to the directional suggestions of the master. In fact, increasing surrender to the guidance of the master involves drastic curtailment of deceptive imagination, the roots of which are deeply embedded in the mental and emotional past of the pilgrim. With the gradual transmutation of the aspirant's imaginative faculty into divine consciousness, the veil of ignorance becomes steadily less opaque. In the end, all imagination comes to a standstill and is replaced by the true everlasting realization of God as the sole reality. Thus, the journey, like everything else in duality, is also an imaginative one, but it leads ultimately to final and enduring knowledge, unclouded by any kind of imagination or transitory fantasy. As the aspirant progresses on the spiritual path, a fundamental modification in the structure of his sanskaras begins to occur. Whereas before, the expression of one sanskara in the world of form resulted in the inevitable creation of fresh sanskaras. This self-perpetuating process now begins to draw to a close. As the aspirant's assertive lower self begins to be removed, the tension of the existing impressions can be released or expressed without the creation of the fresh sanskaras. At first slowly, but with gradually increasing speed, the old sanskaras are spent with less and less attendant creation of fresh sanskaras. With the final cessation of the formation of fresh sanskaras, all past impressions naturally unwind to the finish, and then, free of all impressions, the soul stands fully self-conscious forever. Capital self, conscious forever. The various routes by which the individual may start on the journey are many indeed. Several of the principal ones are referred to as a Dhyana Marga, or the way of knowledge, Karma Yoga, or the way of action, Bhakti Marga, or the way of devotion, and Yoga Marga, or the way of mental and physical discipline. Each of these paths may be regarded as a routine dutifully followed and unthinkably executed, or it may be transmuted into a path of living discovery by having become the focal point of the aspirant's entire being.
A good place to stop, Mahu.
Yeah.
Uh, top of page 159 for next week.